So thank you for that introduction, Jay. It's always really good. It feels like a piece of Schumacher has come into my anxiety about speaking first. And doesn't, when you're at Schumacher, all of this feel really possible? That you feel that when you're sat amongst the trees and in those beautiful gardens, that we can do things differently. I've sat there a couple of times and had that opportunity. And so I think it's a good calm place to start with how I'm feeling, which is actually very excited, quite energized, quite daunted by what's in front of us. We've certainly had 3 months here at CoLab of being in crisis mode. And so it's actually so unbelievably welcome to be able to breathe and stop and pause and just tune into some different conversations. I've been on the call since 9:30 this morning, just checking in with what it was about, and a few people that were on the call were sharing why they were here. And 2 real things stood out for me. One thing, that communities are knackered, people are knackered, was what some person said. And the other thing is that people are really wanting to do something different and are looking to be ambitious around that. So I want to call back to the call to action that Annette gave us this morning when she said, think boldly, think broadly, and think long term. So what I hope I'm going to do in what I'm going to share with you is just share some of my kind of keynote thoughts around that, if you like. So I'll kind of just go into it then. So my lockdown read that I was looking at during lockdown was Designing Regenerative Cultures by Daniel Wall. I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to read that book, but that was really my kind of big introduction to thinking about new economics during this time. And so what that really talks about is moving beyond this idea of the profit mindset, looking at new core values, the sharing economy, cooperation, community. And these are all things that we talk about a lot in our work at CoLab. But the COVID-19 crisis has kind of given us a new sense of urgency and also a new shared experience on that. You can just go back one. So I pulled out some of these values because one of the things that we've really done here at CoLab is to use values as a means of connecting people in this really, I don't want to say emotional, but I don't kind of just mean emotional. What I mean is it's kind of connecting people at the point where it matters. So this idea as if the people and planet matters has to originate from a kind of an inner place where you are motivated personally and not just because of money or because of imperative or it's the right thing to do. And so we've really worked a lot in this, kind of thinking about how we almost think about a new currency. So within that for us, the new currency has been about perhaps the currency of care and thinking about this isn't just about economics as we imagine it, but it's this new currency has come through the way that people have behaved, the way that they have stepped forward during this time. I had one artist who contacted me 2 weeks into lockdown and said, please can I come and just do something because I'm feeling so isolated and connection is like oxygen for me at the moment. And that's really what's important here. It's people wanting to step into that space in the way that they feel that they can. And sometimes that will be really modest. It might not be about setting up a transition town or really doing something quite groundbreaking in terms of the whole county. It might be something in terms of their own life, in terms of their own family. We can move forward a slide. So working with Barrett Cultural Values Centre, I don't know how many of you have come across this organisation, but one of the things that they've done is they've done a global cultural values assessment. So they really asked about 1,500 people, just as a snapshot look in April. They said, like, where are you personally? Where were you before the lockdown? And where do you think we need to be? And they asked them that in terms of being an employee and also running businesses. And what really out from that survey, and you need to look at it if you're interested in thinking about where people are on the bigger picture scale, is that there's been a shift in personal values, moving much more towards making a difference, being adaptable, well-being and caring. So this currency of care is kind of surfacing, and we in our organisation are trying to interpret exactly what that means. And is it about people being all online, all isolated, or is there some kind of balance between how we do connection in different ways, but also what we don't lose in terms of connection during that time? In terms of business, the survey talks about a shift from performance, control and hierarchy to people focus, adaptability, working together. And there's this idea of a healthy culture. So what people need to recover, what they think they need to focus on, is being more adaptable, agile, more teamwork, connectivity, all the things that kind of came through this morning that people are looking for. And that there's some differences still between where leaders are and kind of, I don't just mean leaders as in a person, I mean in terms of an organisation, and leadership like senior organisations, big organisations feeling like they have to lead the way, to much more about let's just listen, let's just ask, let's not tell, let's not force, let's really look at what is emerging here. And if we look at the last slide, so this has really helped us in my organisation to think about this. I don't know if you've come across this, but this is really looking at the three horizons and how we apply it to a regenerative culture. So if we see there, we've got three horizons that we're holding in parallel. So the first one of these is that we're a world in crisis. That's horizon one. That's the most prevalent at the moment. We're doing things to keep the lights on, to maintain the status quo, to feel safe. But also, we're a world in transmission, in transition. And what do we need to be able to make that movement? How do we feel safe? How do we feel connected? What is it that we need to do? How do we plan for that? How do we innovate? Whilst holding the third horizon, which is much more about thinking about the long term and what bigger transformations might be possible. And rather than waiting for these to be one thing after another, this is all seeing that we hold these horizons at the same time. And so we've been really looking at how do you hold those horizons? And in the Designing Regenerative Cultures book, what is really spoken about there is how we have these culturally creative conversations that allow us to explore together how we change our system at the point of level of our physical body, our human system, our families, our communities, and bigger than that. And so it's really been helpful for me to think about, I don't have to stay in crisis mode. That exhausts me, exhausts my staff, exhausts the people around me. I need to find something else to really give me the energy to stay in that space and to be able then to, at the same time, host those conversations and also think longer term about how do I challenge not only my community, but myself to do this better and do this differently. And so this space we've come in today, it really is about thinking boldly about that, thinking about the breadth of things that we might look like, but actually accepting that there might be only a small amount of influence that we have, and that is okay. That is okay to only think that you can do that. And finally, to think long term. We're in this for the long haul. Let's not do any knee-jerk reactions now. Let's be considerate, careful, but also compassionate, but in the term of thinking about radical compassion, which is that we want to take action as well as to really see something change. So I could say more about this, and what I want to leave it with is to really say, if during this time we're connecting to what matters to us and we're genuinely bringing that to the table whilst taking the time to genuinely listen to what other people are saying without being offended by that, that we can allow everything to exist in that space and we can listen and hear all of that and take it into consideration, then I think we already have everything we need to make this transformation. And I, for one, am really looking forward to it. Thank you.
We're up and running. Those of you that are tweeting along, please do follow on Southwest Mutual or Tony Greenham as well on Twitter. But I've got a few slides to go through. So for this session, it was mentioned that we might talk about examples of practice around the world and stories that we could use to sort of vision what this new regenerative Devon could look like. So I'm going to introduce a few of those to you. And I suppose I'm diving down into a part of the system, which is around finance, Amanda having set the big picture scene there. So let me tell you a little bit about Southwest Mutual. But first, I just want to raise a question about money. So the question is, what is money? What does money represent? And I just want to highlight to you that there's a very strong narrative and framing and concept that we tend to have in our society about what money is. And I'd like to suggest to you that it's completely the wrong way to look at it. So if you look at literature, stories, films, books, Harry Potter, Treasure Island, so on and so forth, gold, money, it's all presented as a thing, an object, a thing that you want to hold as much of as you can. It's a thing to possess, money. That's unhealthy. That's a very unhealthy way to understand it, and it isolates us and sets us to compete against the other members of our community. But there's a better way of understanding money, which is that money is a social relationship. So money is something which facilitates exchange between us. Therefore, it's reciprocal. It requires mutuality and mutual trust to really fulfill its potential. I mean, money is not intrinsically evil or a bad thing. It's all a question of how we conceive it and how we use it. So my argument is that money should be mutual. Money is about mutual trust, mutuality. It's about relationships. And that has important consequences for the sorts of banking institutions that you really need to be able to express those values in the financial system. So what are those banks we do have right now? Well, what do they do with our money? Well, I want to tell you about a missing £1 billion in Devon. So if you look at what the big banks do with our deposits that we put into them, almost half of it is devoted to the financial system, trading, speculation, and so on. A lot of it goes to residential mortgages. Only a tiny amount, about £2 out of every £100, goes to lending to small and medium-sized enterprises. And actually, in most places in the country, SMEs deposit more into banks than they are lent back by the banks. And, I estimate that for the county of Devon, that means that our small and medium-sized enterprises are depositing £2.3 billion, getting £1.3 billion back in loans. That's £1 billion escaping from the Devon economy up to the City of London to be used for financial trading and other purposes. And some of it indeed is used for doing exactly the stuff we don't want any more of. Yesterday's economy, investment in fossil fuels. And where is the choice that people in Devon might have to use their savings to regenerate the Devon economy? Well, there are other worlds that are possible, and I'm going to give you 4 examples. The first is the story of the Bank of North Dakota. Now, why the state of North Dakota? Well, because actually it has a population smaller than the county of Devon. It has a population similar to just Devon County Council's area. And yet it's a state, one of the US states. And they founded their own bank back in one of the previous times they were suffering a real economic crisis. And because the economy was controlled from out of the state, local farmers and businesses couldn't access fair finance. There was a coalition of civil society and political groups that came to power and founded their own bank, the Bank of North Dakota. And that now is a major bank of almost $6 billion of assets. Right in the heart of supposed sort of nexus of capitalist economy is a state-owned bank that's very successful. So another scale, let's look at community banking in Chicago. There's an area in Chicago called Devon Avenue that promotes itself as the most diverse street in America. And this is an inspirational example of a bank, and its mission is diversity, respect, and service. So because they say that their mission is to provide the bank that the neighborhood demands, They tailor their services to what the area needs. And because they've got a very diverse population, their staff speak 30 languages between them. They've put on workshops in Assyrian. They've helped Russian refugees to settle. They provide different products for different faith groups across all of the rich variety of faith groups they have in their area. And this is a bank of 210 million odd deposits in 8 branches. And that's only the 130th largest bank in the state of Illinois. It just shows you what a rich fabric of banks they have in the States that we don't necessarily hear about. Interesting stories about community banking. So if you fancy perhaps a trip, let me transport you now to Switzerland. So in Switzerland, the canton of Bern has about 1 million residents. So again, similar size to Devon, one of the Swiss cantons. And they have their own public savings bank, the Berner Cantonal Bank. Founded in 1834, assets of 26 billion and over 1,000 employees. They basically provide the banking for more than half of the enterprises, the small and medium enterprises in the canton, as well as many of the households. It's an absolute powerhouse of that economy. Finally, let me transport you to Japan, the province of Okinawa, which has 1.4 million residents, again, similar size to Devon, and it has its own cooperative bank. There are hundreds of these Shinkin cooperative banks in Japan, and between them, they have almost over 9 million members and a massive deposit base. I logged on to have a look at the website for Koyo Bank, Koza Shinkin Bank, and there it is. Anybody who speaks Japanese can email me later and tell me what on earth any of that says, because I don't speak Japanese. Anyway, so here are just some examples from around the world. Now, why does it matter? Why does it matter? Well, these are all examples of regional stakeholder banks, which are banks that don't just exist to provide profits. They are, how you like to put it, mission-led banks or purpose with profit. They have a social mission. They're social enterprises in a way, I guess you could say. And they all share these features of being led by a social mission, by focusing on a particular region, and by collaborating in networks in order to gain cost efficiencies and sort of financial robustness. And wherever you find these banks around the world, which is everywhere apart from the UK, you will find that they produce 5 benefits: financial inclusion, SME support, I've talked about that a bit, much more of people's money allocated back to the real economy. And very importantly, they contribute to reducing the inequalities between regions within countries, because it captures more of the money within those regions rather than letting it escape to the financial center. And finally, speaking to the theme, really, one of the themes of this summit, they make regional and local economies much more resilient in times of economic stress. On that final point, I want to demonstrate that to you. I was going to say I'm going to apologize for showing some graphs, but I'm not going to apologize for showing graphs because I'm an economist and I can't help it. So here are some graphs. This is showing what happened to bank lending in Germany after the financial crisis. So all you really need to pay attention to here is that there are 3 lines, because Germany has 3 different kinds of banks. It has the large commercial banks, and that blue line there heads downwards because they actually sucked money out of the economy after the financial crisis. They withdrew lending. But their public savings banks and their local cooperative banks carried on lending throughout the recession because they're there for the long term and they were more prudent during the boom. That's what happened in Germany. In Swiss, those cantonal banks that I mentioned, the same story. They were the ones that were there in the crisis, carrying on supporting businesses and local communities. And also they have cooperative banks in Switzerland that did the same. Japan, I mentioned that those Shinkin cooperative banks, they have other regional banks as well. It was those, again, that during the economic crisis stepped up to the plate, carried on supporting their regional and local economies, whereas the large banks dramatically reduced lending. What happened in the UK? Well, of course, we don't have these other kinds of banks. We are reliant on our 4 or 5 giant banks, and they all dramatically reduced their lending during after the financial crisis, which hastened and deepened the recession in this country. So part of what we're about is trying to put another line on that graph as soon as we can in the UK. And I'm just going to mention one. There are many sort of emerging approaches, I suppose, and some of them indeed have been around as long as E.F. Schumacher and Schumacher College, that emphasize how important a sort of more inclusive approach to finances. So this is from the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, CLES, their principles of community wealth building. And one of the 5 principles is about financial power working for local people. And this is all about how we don't have to wait for Westminster to tell us what we can do or provide us with the money or give us the money back that's been sent up there, if you like. We can reinvest the money we already have, as long as we have the right kind of institutions to allow us to do that. Wouldn't that be good? We could have much better power over our own economic strength. So this is what Southwest Mutual is designed to do. It's to fill that gap. It's to put in that piece in the puzzle that we need to build between us to have a more regenerative Devon economy. And here's our vision, purpose, and mission. They sort of speak for themselves, but I want to particularly speak to the final part, the mission. I mean, our purpose, which is permanent, which is effectively to help people to lead fulfilling lives and to flourish through providing them with the right kind of banking and finance products to help them do that. But very important, we also have a defined mission, which is urgent, and Jay outlined it at the beginning of this talk, which is the transition to a low carbon economy and to achieve that in a way that is socially just. So it is a very important part of this bank. It is designed to help to do that in the Great Southwest region. So we will serve not just Devon, but Cornwall, Somerset, and Dorset as well, in order to achieve the scale we need to be a fully licensed bank. But just before I finish off, a few more details about the proposed bank. It's customer owned, 1 member, 1 vote. It's a proper mutual cooperative bank. We haven't had, believe it or not, a cooperative bank in this country ever. The cooperative bank wasn't a cooperative, and building societies aren't banks. See me later if that sounds surprising, but I think many of you know that already. So our mission includes financial inclusion and a focus not just on small businesses, but actually the not-for-profit business enterprise sector, which I think is growing and really important. That's a priority sector for us as well. We think it's up to people to decide how they want to bank, so we want to have branches with actual human beings in that you can bank with, as well as state-of-the-art online and app-based mobile banking. Social and environmental lending, if we're going to achieve this transition, we want to help finance not just businesses, but people as well, to reach that lower carbon lifestyle or that lower carbon business model. We want to be there to help them make that transition. Reinvesting in the local economy I've talked about, but capturing some of that missing billion and reinvesting it back into Devon would be a pretty good place to start. We're not the only one. There'll be a network of these regional mutual banks. There's already Avon Mutual in Bristol, Northwest Mutual started up, spanning from Preston up to the Lake District, Northeast based in Newcastle and Wales as well, Greater Manchester. So there are places around the UK where other people are forming these banks, and we will all cooperate together. And we're aiming to build something that's of a scale that can make an impact, a £500 million balance sheet. I suppose the only bad news is it's not a very quick job starting a bank. We will be fully launched, we hope, in summer 2022. But we are making our progress towards our banking license now and looking for new investment. So to finish off, we think that this is a distinct proposition, and it fits as part of I suppose, the principles of a regenerative Devon social economic system. You know, we're driven by purpose, we are rooted to place, and we're all about participation. So not just that our members control the bank, and there's an equality of dignity and respect because everybody has 1 vote, regardless of how much money they've got with us. But also we seek to work in partnership with other anchor institutions in the region to achieve our shared mission. Thanks very much for listening.
I think fantastic input from Amanda and Tony. What Tony says always drives me nuts. It makes me so angry, in a terribly constructive way, that we have such a profoundly incompetent economic structure in our country. And during the economic crisis, I remember realizing that the country that was seen as the mothership of all things prudent and sensible, i.e. Germany, had the most diverse range of businesses and bankings and financial institutions anywhere in Europe. And they were doing much, much better than we were. We have just, anyway, enough said, what Tony said. Right, okay, I'm going to say essentially some very sort of broad-based stuff. We do live in really unreasonable times. We've been living in unreasonable times for really quite a long time. And I think now that means that we have to start thinking in a much more unreasonable way in order to figure out how we deal with the scale of the transformation. So the current status of Devon is that it is an extraordinarily ecologically diverse county. I'm going to sort of base myself in the notion of ecology, but of course everything is connected. We have really inventive, dynamic, bloody-minded, active communities across the county. And at the same time, we are facing existing threat from climate and ecological breakdown. I'm not going to go into the detail of that. It's just that it's really bad. It's really, really bad. And if you haven't got your head around how bad it is, then quite a lot of the discussion today isn't going to make sense to you. I'm thinking that quite a lot of the people here have understood the level of the threat we're facing. Although I did speak to somebody, two academics this week who both said, oh, well, people have been saying that for the last 20 years. You think, oh, you really haven't got this yet. So we've got this extraordinary ecological basis that has some fantastic strengths and some really significant threats with a whole range of habitats and members of that habitat who are threatened, which just isn't great. So I'm going to talk about 5 big thinks I've got on this. And the first thing is, if we want to try and deal with some of this, we need to think about the words we use, because that frames how we approach them. Economy basically comes from the Greek. It is about management of the oikos. Oikos is our environment, our space, our hearth, our assets, the bit that we live in. Ecology is knowledge of the oikos. Onomedia means management, ology means knowledge. So I don't think you can actually be an economist without being an ecologist. I don't see how we can decide how to manage something without knowing it first. And I would say that our entire financial institutions and structure is a structure that puts ecology at one end, with the weird end, and economy at the very positivist, blokey, present company accepted. And this is how the real world works, and has not yet understood that they are profoundly connected. Germany, for example, has a much more diverse ecology of banking infrastructures. And some of the examples that Tony has given us, we don't. We have a monoculture. It's a really bad idea. Secondly, we do think in straight lines as a species. Some of those human condition flaws that Jay was talking about in his fantastic introduction. Everything that happens in the ecology of Devon is connected to its economy, and vice versa with people involved. And we tend to only think of it in straight lines, in linear ways, and in separate ways. Whereas in actual fact, everything is part of the wider system. It's circular, it's nested, it's interconnected. And the number of people who still talk about us and the environment or the habitat, that's not how it works. It is literally all of us, all those species, trying to cohabit. And we're doing a really rubbish job of it a lot of the time. We still have this sort of dominant paradigm about extraction or dominance, even though we think we might not. It's still there in the back of our mind. So it's a good idea to check oneself. Thirdly, we have to challenge the narrative. We have to challenge those narratives that we are in without even realizing. I'll come back to that in a second. Imagine if, I don't know, if food shops, as part of their financial business model and sustainability and viability, they got planning permission on the basis of health and environmental growth, not just profit. Imagine if we used our food system to actually generate those connections between people and place, rather than just and habitat and soil, rather than just seeing it as a commodity. Our fourth crucial think is nurture those rule breakers, the gorilla planters, the fruit and nut tree geeks, the beaver collaborators. People are doing stuff really differently and bravely and courageously within that natural ecology. And bringing the notion of ecology into the way we think about everything else. So an ecology of institutions, an ecology of community groups, an ecology of thinking, of ideas, the plurality, the stuff that this 3-day event is bringing. Like, what else have we got here that we haven't thought about, that we've accidentally put outside, that we sort of think is outside what we're allowed to think about? The rule breakers are what is required for us to think, you know what, I was thinking in really straight lines about that. I hadn't thought about it that way before. And fifthly, know the water you swim in. Marshall McLuhan, a fantastic digital theorist, said a number of years ago, we don't know who discovered water, but we're pretty sure it wasn't a fish. And what he was saying essentially is that we do not know the water we swim in. We do not see those paradigms and narratives that we're part of. We just get used to it. And he says, in fact, and sort of describing this a little bit when he was talking about this analogy, he said, because people are completely immersed in the water we swim in, as fish in water, they live unaware of its existence. Similarly, when a conduct is normalized, this extractive, reductive attitude to our natural environment, when it's normalized by a dominant cultural environment, it becomes invisible. We do things we do not even see. I think Amanda was talking about some of these things, about challenging the way in which we understand how we operate in the world. Imagine if, what if we did a sort of what if Rob Hopkins imagine if process, where every business or planning application or local authority had a metric which included environmental growth. That is outside the way in which we think about the purpose of the economy at the moment. What if participating in food growing was considered actually part of the NHS and not just a small thing to do with social prescription over here? What if we instituted the New Economic Foundation's National Gardening Leave, so everybody every month had something to do with what was happening outside and how we manage and work with those ecosystems? What we had microshares in every farm so that people understood what farming was and wasn't, that we actually had a process of enabling farmers to invest in decent food growing within ecological farming, and that they had a sense of, I've actually got long-term buyer input from local people. You know, these aren't radical ideas, but we have decided that they are. And if we keep ourselves in this which we have time, and we obey all those rules of thinking, we will never get anywhere else. We will always do what we have always done. Devon is one of the few counties that actually has a biosphere, which literally means, with an H, the circle or the ball of life. Imagine if all of Devon were thinking of that basis in which to operate its economy and its social constructs. Not just one individual place. Those little sort of insulated areas where we do things well allow us to do things badly everywhere else. What if we apply that to the whole county? I think this is about thinking big. I think somebody's got a washing machine on. But you know, it's good multitasking. So think big, imagine fiercely, and if a rule says you can't do something, decide which is the bigger risk, breaking the rule or breaking the planet. Figure out the water that you're swimming in, figuring out what it is, those cages that are locking in your imagination about what might or might not be. And for me, there are three obvious ways forward that we can help. Donut economics. Imagine if Devon and Cornwall together looked at the donut within their own counties and then started operating together on that basis. That could be a beautiful alignment with what Tony's talking in terms of how we manage our economy, that is constantly regenerative and redistributive, putting back in. What if we do some creative rule breaking? Start with your own rules. I'm not talking about going outside and getting yourself arrested. I'm talking about what is it that you think about the world that stops you thinking differently. One of the women who came to our original donut hack was one of the first things she said to me when I asked what her view might be. She said, oh, no, I don't talk in public. She's now since set up one of the most inventive climate action groups in Cornwall. They put together the most extraordinary climate action plan that everybody in Cornwall is looking, and people looking at the rest of the UK. And she's now talking to people outside the county about what they're doing in terms of climate and children and incredible edibles. So break your own rules and think about what it is you can do that will actually deliver multiple outcomes, so that everything is delivering across social, economic and environmental spheres. Because, you know, it sort of makes sense if we're going to move towards somewhere of that nature. So in upshot, I'm just going to put my alarm off. I was trying very hard to stick to my 7 minutes. Think about the words you use, because they're important. You might actually shut down a bit of your imagination. Don't think in those straight lines. Understand that this is about systems thinking. Challenge the narrative. Otherwise, you just sort of go off the same cliff that everybody else is going. Figure out what it is that's making you stick to those old-fashioned lines. Everything that Tony said is absolutely breaking the rules about how we think economics should work. And everything Amanda has said is breaking the rules about how we think business should operate inside those paradigms. Nurture those rule breakers, because we really need them collectively. And remember the fish, because without that, we will simply stay in the water that we cannot even see. So thank you. Go be visionary, disruptive, and even a tiny bit rule breaking, because that's how we will use this critical juncture of massive change to move us into something that could be brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. nearly in my time.